Naomi Riley, welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian and my co-host Christina Buttons. It's so good to see you and finally talk to you. Real quick, a
Thanks.
brief introduction. You're a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. There's the background there. And you're the author of No Way to Treat a Child and a child welfare expert. And you're going to tell us about something that I find to be flabbergastingly, just absolutely astonishing. So let's dive into it.
Great. So I write about child welfare. I got into this a few years ago, and I have been amazed to see that there is a whole movement out there to abolish the child welfare system. It grew up alongside defund the police. And the idea is that children in this country are not in need of protection. They're actually just in need of reunifying or staying with their families, no matter how much abuse or neglect they've experienced. And the only thing we could really do to help them is to give their families more money. We should ignore signs of abuse. We should ignore signs of drug abuse or mental illness in their homes. And we should keep these children with their families at all costs.
Okay. First of all, how pervasive is this? And who's advocating this? Is it the far left? Is it fringe group? I mean, how pervasive is this and who's advocating it for it?
So I would say it started off as a very progressive, very far left movement. There's a guy named Alan Detlef at the University of Houston.
Yep.
There's a professor at University of Pennsylvania Law School named Dorothy Roberts, who's written a couple of books about this. But what's happened is that their influence has spread. As the DEI movement has spread in every other sector of society, this has too. And it's driven by the idea that there are racial disparities in the foster care system. There are racial disparities in terms of how many Black families are investigated, how many Black children are taken into foster care. And of course, as we know, any sign of racial disparities is really a sign of systemic racism. And so they have really glommed onto this idea that the whole system is broken, it's racist, and that we just need to eliminate it. They don't understand any underlying statistics about child welfare. For instance, and I think this is really the most important thing to understand when you're considering racial disparities, Black children are 3 times as likely to die of child maltreatment as their white peers. So just as when we're thinking about defund the police and trying to understand crime and police statistics, we have to understand what is underlying the statistics in child welfare, and what's underlying them is child maltreatment. We have to go to where the maltreatment is occurring. And if it happens to be happening more often in some families than others, then it's our job, obviously, to protect those Black children.
Wouldn't the claim, Christina, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that unlike the defund the police and abolish prison systems and those types of movements, I think this one has been a lot more successful. They've been like working behind the scenes, securing bipartisan support, I think, by sort of appealing to social conservatives, pro-family values. And this movement has, a broader, more mainstream support, a lot of financial support, a lot of influence, and it's mostly flown under the radar. People are not talking about this, and they really should be, because it's completely shocking.
Yeah, and I sorry, I just want to make the connection clear for everybody. When we're talking about this connection, the people fueling this, and please correct me if this is wrong. The people fueling this are primarily social workers, and we have a video, a confrontation at PSU where the social workers come down and start trying to pick a fight with me for asking questions, telling them I'm doing people harm. So like is that accurate that it is the social workers who are primarily fueling it? Am I correct? Is that assertion correct?
Yeah, the people who are staffing child welfare agencies are primarily trained in social work, which has become just a sort of vehicle for social justice, for DEI, and for all of these dangerous ideas.
But there's some like other organizations like Casey Family Programs who
Oh,
have
absolutely. No, I
millions
mean,
of
those are the social workers are the frontline staff. They're the people who are sort of interacting with these families, seeing the problems in these families, and then making decisions along with our family courts to leave these kids in dangerous homes when they really, in many cases, should be removed. But what's underlying that and who is training them? It is partly the universities, but it's universities in partnership with major foundations. And of course, these all have the kind of stamp of approval of our family court system and ultimately the legislature. And it has been in some ways flying under the radar screen, but also a lot of these legislators have bought into this, because when someone gets up and says, kids belong with their families, like, who's going to object to that? Of course, kids belong with their families, and we all believe that. But obviously, you have to look at a family and say, okay, if these parents are, strung out on drugs, repeatedly abusing or neglecting their kids, not feeding them, not getting the medical care, leaving them in the care of abusive boyfriends or other things like that, then no, those kids don't belong with that family. Or we need to do a lot of fixing of that family in order to make that happen. So I think a lot of people are just going, only to a very shallow level, understanding this problem. And then they're thinking, oh, well, we fixed it. We just, kids belong with their families.
Can I try to steel man the other side? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
And you tell me if there's a flaw in my argument. So the idea is that there are some kids who are suffering from malnutrition, and there are some kids who are suffering from what white people would call abuse. But when these children are Black children, you're just trying to impose a kind of racial hegemony on Black families. I mean, this is the culture. You're trying to impose, like, being on time as a white value. You're trying to impose a white standard of treatment of children and nourishment on Black children, and that's inherently racist. That is part of the manifestation of the metastasization of families into Black lives.
Oh, I think you absolutely hear that argument. And indeed, you hear the argument that social workers and folks who work with these agencies need to be more culturally sensitive. And so if they see a Black mother beating her child, they should just rack that up to race. This is a cultural choice that they're making, and we need to be more sensitive to that, which is, by the way, go ahead.
What's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that argument?
Well, we live in this country where everybody's supposed to have equal protection. So, I mean, I personally am offended by that, because I think that if you believe, Black Lives Matter, for instance, you should believe that Black children's lives matter too. And so we shouldn't be putting Black children at any greater risk than we put white children at risk. And I don't think that having a lower standard for Black children is what most people in this country are looking for in the child welfare system.
Wouldn't it just be not a lower standard? I just want to try to steel man this, and please, I just want to be also crystal clear. I don't believe this at all.
Sure.
But I just want to really try to steel man this. Okay, so, but isn't even saying that, like, if a Black woman chooses to beat her child, even that language is fraught with peril, because we're saying beat, which is a value judgment. It's a pejorative, right? In philosophy, it's called a thick term. If a Black woman chooses to hit her child to an extent that most white people would not be comfortable with, I think that's a more neutral way to frame it. You telling the Black woman she shouldn't do that is an imposition of white values. And if you want to say that it's legal, well, those legal systems were constructed by white people. So the whole thing is a kind of systemic violence against Black people who choose to discipline their children the way they feel fit.
Well, I think there are two responses to that. First of all, most Black people don't feel that way. So the idea that we should just assume that this mother who beats her children and the apologists for her are representative of the Black community is, I think, silly. But the second thing is, obviously, you could take this argument ad absurdum to the point where, the United States is illegitimate. So if you decide
they believe that.
Right, I understand. So if you decide the United States is illegitimate, then we shouldn't have police, and we also shouldn't have a child welfare system.
Well,
Like
that's their argument.
no, I get that. I'm just saying I am arguing from the point of view of a reasonable American citizen
A
who
sane person, you
believes
mean?
a sane person who believes we should have a child welfare system. It is our job, as a lot of people like to say, the measure of a society is how well it protects its most vulnerable. So if you believe that, then you believe we should have a child protection system, and you believe we should have a system that protects Black children, white children, Asian children, and Hispanic children equally. It holds them all to the same standard.
There's corporal punishment has been the subject of like of federal lawsuits too. Like there's a Minnesota man named Dwight Mitchell who he argued for his right to physically discipline his children after they were removed in 2014. But like a criminal complaint described linear marks consistent with the kids being struck with a belt, and testimony for his children said that he had punched them and struck them with a belt approximately 16 times. So I don't know about these people who say it's okay to corporally
Right.
punish their kids.
Look, I mean, we've had
Yeah.
different standards throughout American history of what is the appropriate way to treat our children. And I think we have evolved, and I think we've evolved in a good way on a lot of this. But one of the things that I think has to be the hallmark of this is that we have to have one standard for all children. And just like we have one standard for, criminal behavior, we should have one standard for what constitutes child abuse and neglect, regardless. So,
But we don't have one standard for we don't have one standard for anything. We hold different people to different standards in because of their race. The only time I think that's not true is in one of the last bastions of meritocracy, which is sports.
okay, well, I mean, I'm still one of these naive people who thinks that we all deserve equal protection under the law. So I understand that there are fewer and fewer spaces for that, and that itself is a form of white supremacy. But leaving that aside, I think that that's really where we need to focus our energies. And obviously, I write about child welfare all day long, and the cases that I see are horrific. I mean, the cases of torture, the fatalities. I mean, in New York City, just this week, we had one child, a 10-year-old, who was on a feeding tube. His mother had a long history of drug abuse, and she had the child taken away from her, put back in her care, and then the mother died. We're not exactly sure why, but the child starved to death as a result and was found starved to death.
Yeah.
Also, last month,
Common.
right. Also, last month we had a 5-year-old who died after police found him foaming at the mouth, having ingested methadone. His father had 9 child protective services cases opened on him, and it was deemed that this parent was safe to leave a child with. There was an infant who was found having turned blue. Apparently, parents had a long history, had been called on multiple cases of domestic violence and substance abuse. So again, we are making real choices here. These are almost all of the more than 2,000 child maltreatment fatalities that happen in this country. The families have long histories with child protective services. We are making a choice to leave these kids in these homes.
Yeah. I just started sort of writing about this issue too. I came across all of Naomi's brilliant work that she's done on it, and I have an article coming out about it hopefully this week, but I've just been shocked that people aren't talking about this issue because it is insane. Just the whole family preservation ideology is so widespread now. There's this sort of system now, the differential response, where rather than the traditional child welfare response of investigating every abuse allegation, they now sort of route some of what was supposed to be, a small number of like the lowest risk cases through this alternative response where they offer families like services like drug counseling or anger management therapy and things like that. But what ends up happening is the high risk cases still get investigated, but what ends up happening is just too many of them have these alternative response or family assessment, as it's called in Minnesota, rather than having these cases be investigated. And then there's so many times that a child ends up dying who has this really long history of multiple interactions with Child Protective Services, but they failed to protect the child. And so many horror stories. It's shocking.
So, Naomi, why aren't we talking about this? Why isn't this part of the national conversation? Why not?
So I think there are a bunch of reasons for that. First of all, obviously the percentage of families involved with child welfare is relatively small. I mean, unlike, say, when we saw what the effects of defund the police were and everybody walking around a city could see what happened when the police pulled back, I think, these investigations, foster care, it all happens very much below the radar. And unless you happen to know a family or be neighbors and, hear something going on, you don't really understand what's going on in the system. And then when you do see these high profile cases, like the deaths that I just mentioned, they stay with the public for like a hot second, and then people lose track. And the child welfare agencies offer all sorts of excuses. They're understaffed, they have too much to do, blah, blah, blah. But, I will tell you, a couple of years ago, I was looking at, New York City, for instance, at one point had a caseworker had only an average of about 6 kids that they were supposed to keep track of. And they were still doing this, which tells you, again, that this is a choice. It's not kids falling through the cracks, which is what the agencies want you to believe. It is not that. It is a choice based on an ideology that is super dangerous, and we are not understanding it. And it's not just
the ideology is what?
I think there are 3 myths sort of going on here. The first one is that the child welfare system is racist, and we're only taking away Black kids because we're racist and we're bigots. And that's what we like to do, is separate Black children from their families. You see these long diatribes about how this is just like slavery.
Yeah, they've relabeled it family separation.
Yes.
And in their position, keeping families together is a euphemism, basically, for keeping them in unsafe homes.
So the second big myth is that substance abuse is not a problem. And I think you see this like in so many other aspects of society right now, whether it's our homelessness crisis or just, violence on the streets, this sense that drugs are something that's just a choice that adults, make and they can manage. And, it's fine. We can legalize it. You could use a little heroin, on a Friday night. It's not really going to affect your life. And I have to say, like, as much as that's crazy to think about in just the context of an adult, imagine it in the context of a parent of a young child. Like, I've had young children, like the age where they're like mobile but totally irrational, like they're trying to run out the front door and touch a hot stove and jump in the bathtub and swallow Legos. Like, that's hard to manage when you're perfectly sober. Yes. So trying to do it when you're high is ridiculously dangerous. And in the same way that we have regulations for whether people can, fly an airplane or practice medicine when they're high, we need to be enforcing these rules for parents of young children too. The third myth is that what's the problem is that's affecting these families is just poverty. If we gave them enough material resources, a housing voucher, food stamps, whatever, a winter coat, that would solve the problem these families have. It will not, because 90% of these cases involve substance abuse, either alcohol or drugs, and or mental illness. And giving people a check does not solve that problem.
In Minnesota, between 2022 and 2023, 43% of child fatalities were fentanyl poisoning, and many of them had a history of Child Protective Services involvement. They've changed the mandatory reporting laws for like prenatal substance abuse in a lot of states like Minnesota, where, as long as the mom is willing to accept services or whatever, then they're not going to report her. But there are cases where, there's a case of a Minnesota woman who was using fentanyl while she was in labor at the hospital, was caught.
Oh, God. And
then like 10 months later, the baby died of fentanyl poisoning because they didn't take the child away. It's like, obviously.
Yeah, we're seeing a huge spike in kids ingesting fentanyl because it's, around them and they'll just get a hold of one of the pills. Yeah. But we're also seeing a huge spike in unsafe sleep deaths. So parents who are intoxicated rolling over on infants.
Yeah.
is happening more and more
Wow.
too. So again, these are clear dangers, and anyone with half a lick of sense would understand the dangers of drug abuse for parents of young children. But we're supposed to ignore all that and just pretend, again, if we gave them a check, it would be fine. Washington, D.C. is actually piloting a program right now where they're giving $500 a month to families who are child welfare involved, like no questions asked.
For
Now,
moms who have a history of abuse or neglect.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
crazy.
And including the ones who are addicts. Like, what do you give, what happens when you give $500 to someone who has an addiction problem? This is not rocket science.
Yeah.
Have your critics accused you of social Darwinism?
My critics accuse me of racism first and foremost.
Yeah.
That is their favorite thing. Yes, I that you can just Google Naomi Riley racist and you can read all the rants out there, because I am talking about making sure that Black children do not remain in dangerous homes. So that's the big problem.
So
Yeah.
how much power does the president have to solve this, the president of the United States? And
None.
Or does it need laws to be passed by Congress, or is it state by state, or what's
But
the
the
deal?
Biden administration has been bad on this. They've totally endorsed the anti-racist approach to child welfare. There's tons of guidance on their websites about it. Yeah.
So most child welfare agencies, most of child welfare is run by state agencies, but they get about half their money from the federal government.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is, it's controlling the purse strings, but there are really very few consequences for any states that are violating federal laws on this. And by the way, there are some good federal laws on this that were passed like in the 1990s with total bipartisan support. There was the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which said that if a child has been in foster care for 15 of the last 22 months, a state should was that kids were languishing in foster care forever while we waited for parents to clean up their acts, and they just weren't. And so the point is, at what point do you say, okay, this 2-year-old, this 3-year-old, this 5-year-old has spent most of their life in foster care. Maybe we should give them a chance at life and let them be adopted. States routinely violate those rules.
Okay,
And then,
so
yeah.
So I'm trying to figure this out in case anybody is a policy maker, administrator, and they're listening to this and they say, "Oh my gosh, like I want to do something, I want to be involved." So, like state by state, which states are the best and which are the worst, and why?
Mississippi is definitely the worst. Their rate of child abuse is out of control. I've been looking at those stats recently.
So one question is not just, I think we need to look at rates of abuse and neglect, but the one question is, what are the rates of repeat maltreatment? Because those are cases where you have a child who has come to the attention of the system, and now we have done something and they're being abused and maltreated again. So that's sort of a question that I think is important to ask. You can look at maltreatment fatality rates, but one question we looked at AEI, and we commissioned a report on this, was we did a report card about how long states were leaving kids in the foster care system. And we found Utah came out on top and Illinois came out on the bottom. And I think there's some really interesting reasons why. So for one thing, Illinois has a very high disproportionate number of Black kids who were remaining in the foster care system much longer than white kids. And the question is why? And the answer is the culture, which opposes transracial adoption. So you've got Black kids who are in the system, and you have these social workers who will do whatever they can to make sure that these kids are never adopted by a white family. They would rather have them languish in foster care year after year than have them go to a safe, loving family who happens to be white. They will even take them out of long-term foster homes who want to adopt them just to make sure that there is not a transracial adoption happening. And I think that we need to sort of zero in on how this racial nonsense is affecting kids' lives.
Yeah.
Christopher Hitchens said it takes religion to make a good person do a bad thing. It takes ideology to make a good person do a bad thing. My daughter is adopted from China, and I've been accused of transracial kidnapping.
Well,
Yep.
Jeez.
The rate of
People are
international
intense.
adoption, by the way, has plummeted in recent years. And a lot of that is because of ideology at the State Department, which is very much like, oh, we don't want to, snatch these children from other countries. We should just support those other countries and make sure that they can find, homes there. A lot of these countries have they have no tradition of adoption, and these kids will just languish in orphanages as a result of our adoption policies. And I should also say, by the way, this bullshit about the transracial adoption, like there's so many stories that come out now about people who are like, oh, my lived experience is that I didn't know who I was and this was so terrible. Longitudinal studies that look at transracial adoption compared to same race adoption find that the kids have the same outcomes educationally, economically, socially, emotionally. Yes, adoption is always involves a trauma because either your parents have died or your parents have done something terrible and you can't live with them. But once you sort of control for the idea that this is a kid who's adopted, measuring transracial versus same race adoption, there is no difference.
My response to that used to be, now I don't really care either way, but my response to that used to be, well, have you taken a child of your own race out of an orphanage who's disabled? Our daughter was disabled. Have you done that? Have you taken a disabled child out of? If you haven't, then shut the fuck up. But if you have, then I'm more than willing to have that conversation with you.
Yeah.
But it's all just vitriolic, bombastic. It's just nastiness. It's just their minds have been overridden by the ideology.
Yeah. It's all fueled by ideology and not evidence. Like the more I look into it, the crazier it gets. And I mentioned this before we started, but this is exactly how I felt when I started reading about all the gender stuff that I spent the last 2 years reporting on. It gets crazier and crazier. There's this whole movement to sort of they say that foster care is now just traumatic and abusive and it should be avoided at all costs. This has been like this narrative that has been dominant for, at least in recent years, I've been noticing it. A lot of newer articles about it. And of course, like foster care is not a great outcome, but I think the abuse rate in foster care is pretty rare. Wouldn't you say so, Naomi? But they're prioritizing the lived experiences of kids who say that they've had a bad time.
So the abuse rate of kids in foster care is about 1/10 what it is in the general population. So that's useful to know. I think it's also
1/10 lower.
Yeah. Your likelihood of being abused in foster care is 1/10 of what it is.
But you would not know that.
Wow,
if you were to search on Google right now about foster care, all you would see is just how awful it is and how bad the outcomes are. And
wow.
Now, I would say, obviously, as a society, we have a special responsibility to make sure that kids are not abused in foster care. If we're going to remove these kids from their home, we should damn well make sure that they're safe in the home we put them in. Now, that being said, the evidence that has recently been released about foster care is fascinating because it actually suggests that foster care for certain kids really improves their outcomes. So there was a study that was just done by a professor at Duke, and he was looking at data that was like 100,000 kids, and he was looking at data, I think it was from Michigan. And what he did was he looked at kids who were sort of these marginal cases, like we could leave them in their homes or we could not leave them in their homes and sort of provide support services. And he had a way of sort of randomizing it, which is a little too inside baseball to explain right now, but I just wrote an article about this. But what the most interesting thing is that the kids who spent time in foster care and were then reunified with their parents actually had better academic outcomes and lower rates of later incarceration. And what that tells you is that sometimes foster care is needed as a wake-up call for parents. Like if they have a serious drug problem, serious mental health issues, just saying, okay, we'll leave your kids here and you just have to go to this anger management class once a week, that is not going to fix the behavior that has caused this problem. If you say, look, we have to remove your kids right now, it is a terrible thing, but we need you to get your act together in order for you to be reunified with your kids, that actually can produce better outcomes. And obviously, people who believe in smaller government and don't want the government to interfere in every aspect of their lives do not want to say, like, oh, it's better when the government comes to take your kids away. But there is a small segment of the population who are experiencing this maltreatment, which is destructive to their lives. And we need to figure out a way to get them out of the harmful situation and get their parents to clean up their acts. And foster care is what we have.
I would be willing to bet you with odds, though I have zero evidence, direct evidence for this, that not a single word you just said, not one word is mentioned in any social work class, period.
Oh, definitely not.
I would
Definitely not.
bet you with odds they don't show the other side of the story. It's just it's purely ideologically driven.
They use all of the statistics that show that Black children are overrepresented at every stage of child welfare, except for the one that shows that they're 3 times as likely to be to die of fatalities due to abuse than white children. Like,
social workers then do exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to do. Instead of helping people, they hurt people. Instead of saving lives, they kill people.
It's even the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is
Right.
they have a whole advocacy page now identifying systemic racism as a major problem in child welfare, and their recommendations also have to do with reducing disparities. That's all they're concerned with, is reducing the disparities, which means leaving Black children in unsafe homes so that they can get to the same rate of foster care removals as white children. It's totally insane.
And the other statistics they love to cite are, quote unquote, outcomes for kids in foster care. So they say, oh, kids who spend time in foster care have worse outcomes than kids who don't spend time in foster care. But of course, the kids who are in foster care experienced years of abuse and neglect. How do you just discount all that and just pretend it was foster care? That's the problem. But, the basic understanding of, the difference between correlation and causation does not ever occur to a professor in one of these classes to explain.
Well, that's because I just published a piece about this. That's because their goal is not to teach people how to reason through problems or to really do its best for the kids. Their goal is to replicate the dominant moral orthodoxy. And when they do that, then they discharge that in their professional lives.
Yeah.
And so I do think that a lot of this stuff, and I'm certainly not going to say 100% of it, is directly traced back. The ideological roots is directly traced back to the university system. And then they embed these kind of ideological agents in administrative and other positions in society.
Oh, yeah. It's anti-racism. They say it right out front. The HHS says we need to take an anti-racist approach to child welfare. So that's directly from all of the critical race theory stuff and focusing solely on race disparities. But their misdiagnosis of the problem, which is institutional or systemic racism, it means that the solutions that they provide are going to be the wrong ones. And it's definitely seems to be happening because the rate at which children are dying from abuse, and Black children in particular, like, it's just going up and up and up every year. And it's accelerated like in the last few years.
And what you see is that also this correlation has occurred, which is that the maltreatment fatalities have gone up approximately 17% in the last 5 years. We've seen on federal reports. And what you see is that a lot of states they're bragging about how far they have reduced the number of kids in foster care. Some states are saying we reduced the percentage of kids in foster care. We reduced it 40%, 50%, 60%. Yeah. And the question is, people like this is to answer one of your questions about how this has sort of become something that people have ignored. People think when you say we've reduced the number of kids in foster care, they think, oh, that's great. Like, we've solved the problem. Like, foster care is the problem. And if we reduce the number of kids in care, we've solved it. And I think for a lot of people, like, logically, if you don't think about it too hard, that makes sense because, foster care is bad. We don't want a lot of it. But foster care is an artificial number. We decide on a policy level when to take kids into foster care. And so we can just decide any day we want to take more kids into foster care, we want to take fewer kids into foster care. And what these states have done is said, we're just going to take fewer kids into foster care. Like, we just don't think it's a good idea. And so we would rather leave them in dangerous homes than have to increase our foster care population. And by the way, one way they sell this too is that'll save us money.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, Christina, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just asking Naomi about Indiana recently because I came across some testimony from a Senate finance hearing just happened a couple months ago about, Indiana bragging about how they've reduced the amount of kids going into foster care and they've reduced the black to white disparity. So I started digging through all of their maltreatment reports for the last 10 years. And there's almost like, I can't say like relationship, but there's like this inverse correlation where the years that they had the lowest amount of Black children removed from foster care, there's this spike in Black fatalities. And then the years where they had the most kids going to foster care, there's the lowest number of Black fatality. It's just like there's something is going on here.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not that, we should just take more and more kids into foster care, but it's clear that there's a level where we have to decide, okay, this maltreatment is too much. We think this kid is at too high of a level of risk and they should be taken into care. And what you have is the ideology has overridden common sense here. And so we're sending these workers into these homes and saying, ignore the drug abuse, ignore the alcohol problems, ignore the fact that this home looks like it is, infested because the parent is not sober enough to figure anything out. You should ignore all that because the kid in front of you is Black and you don't want to contribute to the quote unquote family separation system. And it's interesting, just one other thing is that you have a huge workforce problem right now. A lot of people do not want to go into child welfare. You have 40% turnover at some of these agencies. And I'm convinced that aside from pay and other things, part of the problem is that you train these people to think okay, you're here to solve the problems of racism and social justice. They walk into one of these homes and realize that they cannot, in good conscience, just walk away and leave that kid there. But then if they take that kid away, they're part of the systemic racism. So that you've put them in an untenable position.
Okay, so this is pretty ghastly. I have two questions for you. What is the response when someone says to you, okay, so let's pretend I'm one of your more rational critics, if that's even possible. But let's say that I would say something to you like, you're only advocating these positions because you're some kind of alt-right crazy conservative. Or is that because I get that when I criticize the fact that
conservatives should be talking about this because it's totally crazy, but that's not even, it shouldn't be a bipartisan issue.
Well, I mean, clearly child welfare should not. So when I'll say, geez, the president, someone running for president of the United States should have a policy position. They should put that up. And then I get, 50 tweets, you Trump supporter, you're a Trump maniac. No, I don't like him either. I'm just saying, if you're running for president, even if you disagree with the policies, you should say what they are. That doesn't make me a right winger. So what is your response when someone says to you, well, you're only advocating these things because you're coming at it through an ideology. You're not really an evidence-based person. You're just, they have their ideology and you have your ideology, and you're just trying to kind of play the power game. That's the power knowledge, as Foucault calls it.
Right. So I would say that what I increasingly hear from people, and I work at AEI. I have a working group here that includes about 24 people or so, veteran judges, agency heads, people who work for nonprofits. And I would say it's probably one of the most bipartisan groups in Washington right now, because what you have is a whole group of sensible liberals. I like to joke with them sometimes that they've been mugged by reality, that these are people who have come to understand that the far progressive left has hijacked this system and that they are trying to impose very non-commonsensical solutions for kids who are seriously abused and neglected. And I think, it's not a conservative position to say that there are always going to be kids who are in this position. There are always going to be parents who abuse or neglect their children. And I don't think that we're going to create a world where that never happens. And I think it's crazy to live in this land of make-believe to imagine that it's not happening now. And so the question is, like, what are you doing to protect these kids? Like, there is a whole ideology around, like, oh, the goal of the Child Welfare Agency should be to create family well-being for every American or something like that. That to me is overreach. That to me is mission creep. The job of the Child Welfare Agency is child protection. It's like an ambulance. Like, we send the ambulance to wherever they need it. We don't ask, like, okay, let me look at my checklist and see where have we picked up too many Black people today with our ambulance? Okay, we're only going to pick up white people from now on.
Oh
But
my
like,
God.
that is what's driving this. So if that seems like an alt-right position to people, like, that's fine, but that's not how I would identify it. And I think that there are plenty of sensible Republicans and Democrats in this country who would completely agree with me on this.
It's a perfect analogy.
Okay, let me ask you another question, and I know you're not in the field of rampant speculation, but let's play the pretend game here. So, which many people in society are very good at.
Yes, exactly.
But let's see if we can indulge these impulses. Okay, so let's just pretend that the far left progressive wing, not only does it currently dominates sociology and other fields, and it largely dominates the academy, largely, not exclusively. There are some holdouts. Let's say that they get their way and they're able to successfully lobby, change laws, etc. What does their vision look like at the end of the day? Like, they win, what does it look like? I mean, what does it actually look like, and what do they think it looks like? Do they think it looks like some Shangri-La where all these kids are like, what do they? I mean, I have no idea. What do they think it looks like?
So Dorothy Roberts, this professor at University of Pennsylvania, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Torn Apart, in which she explains why we shouldn't have a child welfare system. And at the end, and throughout the book, really, she has this sort of weird historical understanding of, like, the Black family, where she thinks it was all just one big sisterhood collective of, like, women taking care of children. Like, men are not really in this picture. I'm not sure where they went. But the goal is, like, sort of to have communal supports of sisterhood with a lot of government funding thrown in. So she's a very big advocate of, the only problem these families have is poverty. So if we just sort of all agree to, like, jointly take care of each other's children with a lot of funding from federal, state, or local governments, the kids will all be fine. How's that for make-believe?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to do the mental gymnastics it takes to make that not merely intelligible, but, like, it's just so divorced from reality. I'm trying to think, what is the mindset and the structure of belief that one would have to have, and what are the antecedent beliefs that one would have to have before they would believe that?
Well, you'd have to, obviously, like the Black Lives Matter movement has, advocates for the destruction of the nuclear family. Like, that's definitely part of this ideology. It's like that, of course, is the nuclear family is white supremacy. I should add here a kind of interesting factoid that people might want to know is that one of the reasons that I think Black children experience maltreatment at a higher rate in this country is that children who grow up in a home with a non-relative male, usually a mother's boyfriend, are 10 times as likely to be abused as children who grew up with two biological parents. And right now, there are
Matt
racial...
Thornton gives that statistic.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there are racial disparities when it comes to family structure in this country. So if you have many more Black families that have a mother living with a boyfriend who is not the father of the children, those children are at much higher risk. Now, I always have to say, obviously, there are plenty of great stepfathers out there and plenty of men who have stood up and stepped up for the, children who are not biologically theirs. But this is just the fact of the matter. These are statistics that I'm giving you. And so trying trying to suggest that the real, way forward is to undermine the nuclear family is the exact opposite of what these children need in terms of protection.
So many horror stories I've come across too that align with that. A lot of times it's, like the mother's boyfriend who beats the kid and then the kid ends up dying. And I know this is going to sound kind of weird, but it couldn't I couldn't really like help but think about how other animals in, the animal kingdom, like lions will eat the children of the lioness, that, if it's not their children, they'll eat it. They'll kill it and eat it. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
look, there's a biological thing that goes on here. I mean, human beings
Yeah.
are on some level animals too, but like the jealousies that occur and all that stuff, it definitely enters into factors of family violence. But you also get, mothers are partially to blame here too. I mean, a lot of times, they are leaving their children with people that they know to be dangerous, including boyfriends. Sometimes, again, drugs are an issue here where the mothers are with a guy who is violent because he gives them access to drugs or alcohol or whatever it is they want, or and so all of these things are intertwined. But you can't suggest that domestic violence is not a problem, that drugs are not a problem, that all of these aren't signs of risk to children.
Okay,
Right.
so I want to go. I want to go to something. If if you don't mind talking about it, could you please talk about, because I moved out of that cesspool, Portland, Oregon. Can you please talk about your experiences in seeing homeless children in encampments, etc.?
Yeah. So last summer I went to Portland, and it is the apocalypse looking place that everybody says it is. But I spent a lot of time talking to people who did homeless outreach in Portland, and they reported that a lot of times they see kids who are living in these tents, small children who are living in homeless encampments. And one of the homeless outreach people I talked to said, the year before, he called, and he does this still, call Child Protective Services and say, like, look, I saw a 4-year-old girl wandering around this encampment with some pretty dangerous looking men. Her mother is clearly, very high. And first he was put on hold for 45 minutes. But then when
Yep.
they finally
Yep.
got on the phone, he was told literally, sorry, sir, there's nothing we could do. Poverty is not a crime. And so essentially there's nothing they could do. They left this kid, he left this kid in this encampment, and he regularly encounters, people in social services in Portland who think, again, this is just a choice that adults are making to keep kids in tents, to keep them around. When the cops go into these places, or when homeless outreach people go into these places, they're wearing hazmat suits because touching the fentanyl, the foil, is dangerous to an adult. So let alone a 2-year-old gets a hold of it. I mean, this is what we're talking about with the exposure to fentanyl deaths. So, Portland has really made this decision that, the kids are like basically property of their parents, and the parents can do whatever they want, however dangerous it is, because drugs are okay.
Yeah. And that has been sort of the child welfare philosophy as of late, is sort of just prioritizing the desires of parents over protecting children.
I
And
don't
that's where
know.
you see these decisions come in.
I gotta tell you, it's kind of like Stalin dying of old age. I think the thing that really gets me about all this is that none of these people will be brought to justice. The surgeons who mutilate kids' genitals, they won't be brought to justice. Ted Wheeler and his henchmen, they won't be brought to justice. These people can just destroy lives, destroy children, destroy American cities. The district attorneys, they won't be brought to. None of these people. Everybody's getting. I mean, this is really end of empire shit. So when you did you actually see some of these camps? You went in there in Portland.
So the only people that I interviewed some teenagers who were in these tents. They were clearly, there was no supervision. They were runaways. And, police were interacting with them, but there was no attempt to like bring them into a shelter or anything. Again, this was a choice. The small children I did not see because the parents are typically hiding them. And so, but a number of the homeless outreach workers I talked to have seen them. And one of the reasons I went out there was that I was actually in touch with an emergency room worker who was seeing kids, who had fentanyl exposure brought in, both, from homes, but also from homeless shelters, and was trying to sound the alarm about this.
So, okay. So one thing you said, it's kind of resonant in the back of my mind. I just want to make sure I understood it correctly. So like fentanyl is so deadly that if you touch it, it can kill you. Is that, I mean, I have no idea. Is that right?
If a kid gets a hold of a piece of fentanyl foil and like puts it in their mouth, because of
Oh,
course
in their
kids
mouth.
put
Yeah.
everything in their mouth. Yes. And similarly, I mean, people are in hazmat suits because there are fumes that they can be breathing in that are very dangerous. But yeah, with the kids, I mean, it's two things. It's the foil, but also fentanyl pills basically just look like Advil. They're like bright blue, and you need a whole lot of them to maintain your high over the course of the day. So what happens is, like, a person who is addicted, might lose track of 2 of the 30 pills that are in the bottle. They might roll under the couch or the coffee table or the chair. A kid gets a hold of them, puts them in their mouths. And we are seeing, by the way, like record uses of Narcan on children under the age of 5. Like, that's what happens. The emergency personnel show up and they immediately realize, what this kid has ingested.
Yeah, it's interesting. I called I was in Portland a while ago, and I called the police because some guy passed out in front of me. I called 911, and it took, I don't even know how long before someone answered. And then, one of the first things they asked, I mean, it's not an unreasonable question, but one of the first things they asked is, do I have Narcan on me? I'm like, no. Like, I don't know. I mean, even if I had it, I'd have to know there was a Good Samaritan law in case I screwed it up somehow. But so do the people of, and evidently it's hard to screw up, but still, I'm not a physician. I've never done anything like that before. I just would not be comfortable. I don't know. So do the people, did the people who make these laws, I mean, when they see this, do they think that this is a good thing? I mean, do they think that this is how we should move society toward having more encampments like this? I mean, or do they, what are they thinking? I mean, what could possibly be running through their minds?
So, as you know, Portland passed a measure to legalize.
Yes.
They've recently walked some of that back. But I interviewed a bunch of people while I was there, and I said, people willingly told me, "Oh, I voted for this," but maybe it was sold to them as a way to be compassionate, as a way to help people, like, not go to prison for using drugs. And I think it's no one was going to prison for, like, using, smoking pot before this. And so the way the campaign was sold, though, was a number of people just said, well, we just thought it would be better to get these people into rehab beds. Well, now what's happened is there are a ton of empty rehab beds in Portland because there's nobody saying to you, if you don't go to rehab, you're going to go to jail. So people don't voluntarily, like, oh, I've had too much of this fentanyl today, I'm going to check myself into rehab. But Portland had drug courts where if you got arrested, they would say to you, like, okay, now you have to go to rehab. You don't have a choice about it. And so now there are empty homeless shelters, empty rehab beds, and zombies walking through the streets on drugs with their kids.
And they look at that. I mean, do they have enough wherewithal to know that this is not an ideal state of society? Or do they look at that and they just say, oh, that's their lived experience. That's just their way of being in the world. And who am I to judge?
Well, I think the ordinary citizens, the reason that they pushed to walk this law back is they did realize this is not acceptable.
Yeah, I'm not sure
But
that's
in terms
true.
of the professionals, like, who are out there, they're still, I think, really attached to this ideology, again, that drugs are just another lifestyle choice we can make. And so, for them, we should not walk this back because, any kind of criminal punishment or accountability. I mean, Christina mentioned earlier this idea that when kids are born substance exposed or their parents are testing positive for drugs in the hospital, increasingly the answer is, oh, just, give them a pamphlet. They're called plans of safe care. Give them a pamphlet which offers them some voluntary services. Mass General Hospital in Boston has adopted this policy. Don't report them to CPS. Give them a pamphlet. Like this is nuts.
And seems Minnesota too.
Yeah, it's just
a bunch of other states.
What, you've just sent home an infant with a parent who is incapacitated. Like, again, sober people have trouble caring for infants. Perfectly sober people. Like, you don't sleep. Like, it's, you're trying to figure out, does this child have a fever? Did I feed them enough? Did I burp them? Why aren't they, what's with the diaper? Like, trying to do that while you're high is insane.
Right. And that's what's so crazy to me, that, I mean, they keep pushing all of these different narratives and avoiding the obvious, because they can't deal with reality, that abuse happens more often in Black families, or that substance abuse is driving the child welfare crisis. It's so, there's so many similarities between this and all of the gender stuff that I spent the last few years reporting on. There's just so many similarities because it's an ideology. It's not supported by evidence.
Right.
They have their narratives. They have the mainstream media helping to push out these narratives and just sort of flooding the public domain with the narratives. They have the euphemisms,
and lived experience. That's the thing. Over and over again, you have people who have lived experience. They'll tell you, I had the worst experience in foster care, and so no child should ever go into foster care again. Yeah. That's the narrative. Then go testify before Congress about this. And
this is the same.
I'm not denying that's your experience, but we cannot make policy for a country of 300 million people based on what happened to you alone.
Yeah.
Is this destruction deliberate? And if so, why? Because and I say that I have a friend of mine who said, who moves in the public space, and he told me that he thinks that the reason the progressives don't want to clean up homelessness or make any headway in the homeless problem is because that shows that there's a problem with capitalism. So is this destruction deliberate?
It's possible that, like, on the highest levels, that some academic thinks this is all a great idea. But I think that generally the people who are on the ground making these decisions genuinely think that they are doing the right things for these kids. Like, I just think they've been brainwashed about it. But I don't think that they're like, oh, how fast can we destroy Portland so that we end capitalism? People who work for child welfare agencies are not, they're people who I think just got into this profession because they thought they should help children. I really do.
I just to push back on something you said before, 44% of people voted for Mike Schmidt, the former DEA. That is just flabbergasting to me. Absolutely flabbergasting. 44% of the people wanted Mike Schmidt to continue his policies of rampant, unending, complete destruction of the city. So I wonder how much people, and this is something I've been thinking about, maybe Christina, this is your bailiwick with the gender stuff, how much people connect public policies to the visual and consequential effects of those policies. I mean, I wonder if they just think that it's just kind of like, I don't know what they think. Like, his history is just marching forward, and my vote, policies have nothing to do with this. This is just systems. I mean, I don't even know what they think. Like, but it does seem to me that there has to be some disconnect between what people think that policy is capable of doing and that policy does anything at all.
Christina, don't you think, like, even with the gender stuff, I think a lot of people out there just think they're being compassionate.
Yeah.
I think they're misguided and completely wrong. But I think the same thing is true in child welfare. And the same thing is true with getting homeless people off the streets. Like, they think they're being compassionate by not punishing you for your drug use. They think you're being compassionate by making sure your kids stay with you and we don't take them away. They're making sure that you're being compassionate by, letting you be the gender you think you are. Like, I think this has just been sold to them in a particular way.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they think they're out to destroy anything. They're just trying to be nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
that's,
Huh.
but you know, that,
Road to hell, you know.
yeah, that's what I mean, there's just, I mean, the child welfare issue and then also the residential treatment issue, which I've came across, you know, a couple months ago too. I mean, these have really just shifted my perspective, I think, on, you know, I was kind of singularly focused on the gender issue for a while, and I thought like, okay, well, maybe like this is sort of an isolated thing, but it's just all of these progressive ideologies are so backwards. They're so bad for this country. And these people have just infiltrated all of our institutions and enacted all of these insane policies. It's kind of a disaster. And I just want them out.
But
I just
we've
want
let that
common sense
we've
to
let that
reign.
happen. We've let that happen. Collective cowardice has let that happen. People being too afraid to speak up again about things that are clearly asinine,
Well, so
clearly
many
idiotic.
people are completely clueless, just going about their life, and then they're just sort of assured by the Democrat Party that they're doing the right thing by voting Democrat, and they're assured by mainstream media that there's nothing to see here, everything's good. Uh, but they're basically just sort of acting like a PR arm for Democrats, and people just go about their lives have no idea what's really going on,
Yeah,
unless it
it's
personally affects them, or unless they do any kind of like really deep dive into policy research, like uh, some, you know, it's just,
it is amazing. I mean, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris is a nincompoop. She's a total ignoramus. I mean, you can say a lot of negative things about Trump, and I haven't recently because I've just been so utterly disappointed in the Democrats. But do you think people are too afraid to vote for someone on the right or even a moderate Republican or a centrist because they'll be considered to be right wing? Do you think that's something that's going on, or they're so afraid of the fear of label contamination?
yeah, it's been so effectively demonized. It's like in liberal circles, it's the worst thing you could be, is being called right wing.
But I will say, like, when it comes to the child welfare issue, like, I think conservatives have been kind of MIA on it. Like, I don't you don't I mean, not to toot my own horn, but I'm basically the only one out there talking about this at like a right-wing, center-right think tank. Like, there if you talk to state legislators and ask them about child welfare, foster care policy, the two responses you get are, if I come to the table on this, they'll just yell at me for not giving them more money or call me a racist. And they are just like, fine, I'm out. Like, there are other issues that I can talk about. And so, yeah, I think that there is like a lack of interest in kind of digging in on this issue. And there's also just a fear of what you're going to get labeled if you say something that is outside of the mainstream, like against what the mainstream media says, against what the major foundations and universities say. But, you know, even legislators who are willing to say other conservative things don't want to get involved in this issue. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
But all they have to do is read all of your articles. Like, you've laid the groundwork, you've debunked all the arguments, you have all of the stats. People
I
should be
tried.
talking about this more.
That would be
It's
nice.
baffling that they don't.
Yeah, so
Hopefully that
I think
change
that's
that
right.
soon.
Reed, pull that up so that we can pull that up so that everybody can see that. In case anybody wants to actually, instead of us talking about your stuff, in case anybody actually wants to read your stuff.
Yep.
And can I do something? I've never done this before, but can I do something rather radical? And you can tell me to go screw myself and go away if you want. But I would like to volunteer you to give free guest lectures in any graduate class of sociology. You can zoom in, and if they want to hear the other side of an issue, if they want to hear something that goes against the narrative, that is evidence-based, that works for the rights of children, if they truly care, if you genuinely care about children's welfare, and like you said before, if they're just trying to be, I don't like the word nice, it's a saccharine weird word, but if they want to be, nice or whatever,
Compassionate.
that's a much better word. Yeah. If you want to be compassionate, then you should, it is incumbent upon you to make decisions based upon the best available evidence. And that means considering positions that you might not have otherwise thought of, if somebody, and again, if you think that this isn't inappropriate for me to ask you this, you certainly tell me. Would
No,
you be willing to
I'm
go
happy to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you'd be willing to talk to people, to give guest lectures for free over Zoom in graduate schools of social work. If you want to share some of the data and what you think should be done to help these kids, you would be willing to do that.
Absolutely. And I've even written about how I'm willing to do that and how I think that more people need to speak up on this issue. And I get canceled and I get called a racist and people get mad at me, but I am happy to debate anybody on this topic. I'm
We don't
happy to
even need a
speak.
debate.
I know I'm
even
happy
need
to
a debate.
speak to classes. I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
I'm willing to go out there. I publish in any place that will have me. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And so I just want to punch this home, because if people genuinely care about child welfare and they're studying social work, it's incumbent upon them to learn what the best available evidence is from different sources. And you will go and speak to their class for free in the graduate school over Zoom and talk about the evidence in your research and what you found is in the best interest of children. Is that correct?
100%.
Okay. Thank you. Christina,
There's
sorry.
so much data out there because states have to report their child maltreatment data, although it's not perfect, right, Naomi? There's a lot of data out there, but it's still an undercount.
Yeah, especially fatalities we're undercounting. We have a new project called livescutshort.org that looks at maltreatment fatalities. And one thing that's happening is a lot of states are characterizing some of those drug-related deaths that we're talking about as just accidents. So, 5-year-old ingests fentanyl and that's an accident. And so we don't need to go do any further investigation and it doesn't get counted as a maltreatment fatality, which is a real problem. So just trying to understand more about that and why our data is not as good as it should be.
I was wondering what the process for that is like, because I was just looking at Indiana's maltreatment data and, they have, something like 300 kids a year now dying. And then they select about like 60 of them and say these ones were due to maltreatment, to abuse or neglect. I just wonder what their process is like for determining. I'm sure there are freak accidents, but
we need more transparency around this issue because especially people with ideological agendas are going to try to cover some of this up.
For sure. Yeah. Can we, two questions. One, just a quick follow-up, Christina, you going to Gen Spec this year? You are, aren't you?
Yeah. Lisbon.
So, in Lisbon. So we're going to give a talk in Lisbon, and I invited the people from WPATH, which is the trans activist organization, same time. I think it's quite literally across the street, like one street away or something like that.
That's what they do. They host their conferences across from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health.
And I invited them to come up on stage and have a conversation with me, not a debate, a conversation. And of course there was crickets, and that's what I expect with my volunteering services to their classes. There will also be crickets, because I think the ideological component is so strangulating, and that's what it is. It's a kind of ideological strangulation. So I don't see that happening. And then I lost the second thing I was going to say. I totally spaced it. Sorry, I spaced it.
So you'll appreciate this as an adoptive parent. So a few months ago, I wrote an article that was just reporting on a survey of adult adoptees, and this journalist from Texas tweeted at me, "You just saying this because you're an adoptive mother with an agenda." So I'm not an adoptive mother, but she decided that I must be an adoptive mother.
Oh, interesting.
Because I have Black children. And it was fascinating because she couldn't possibly imagine another way that I could have Black children. But we had this back and forth where she actually, it was fascinating. I'll send you the article.
Make a really inappropriate comment.
You wrote about this in Quillette. But what was fascinating was that even after both I and another person explained to her that I did not have adopted children, she doubled down and was like, well, if that's true, then, you have this whole agenda and, you're trying to steal these babies. Like it was crazy. But she explained to me that everybody in the world of child welfare knows that I'm an adoptive mother. And I was like, I don't know what this like grand conspiracy is of people that you're talking to, but why don't you just talk to me? I mean, there's a whole world out there of people who are trying to shut me up.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great example of when you'd use a defeasibility question. You'd start off before you said anything. You'd start off with a single question. What evidence could I show you that would cause you to change your mind?
Yes, exactly.
And then you place the burden on her. And then, I mean, I have obviously no idea what you would say, but I would say something like, well, give a 23andMe test.
Right. Well, I encouraged her to go to my Wikipedia page because this is not exactly a secret.
Yeah. Well, Wikipedia is corrupt. I now remember what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Can we even agree on what the definition of welfare is with regard to children? Is there a common accepted definition of that?
It's why I prefer talking about child protection, frankly, because I think child welfare, again, is like this whole idea that we need to promote every family's well-being, which I don't think is the job of our government. Child protection from actual danger is the job of the government.
Pennsylvania, right? Don't they have like they try to reunite children with sexual abusers?
Oh yes,
there's a whole
protocol for reuniting children with their sexual.
Yeah,
this is like
this stuff is crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy that people are not talking about this. Yeah, there's a whole protocol.
Insane.
Sorry, Naomi was just telling us about it. What?
No. It's like several pages that explains like, well, you should have somebody else in the house and, you should leave doors open and all. It's just, it's insane. But like they're determined to, engage in this reunification at all costs.
Can you repeat that again? Because I just want to make sure I heard that right.
Okay. So
Christina,
there's a protocol in Pennsylvania, and it may be in other states, but I actually found it in Pennsylvania, for reunifying children who have been removed from their homes because of sexual abuse, reunifying them with their sexual abuser.
I don't even see how that's possible. Like, I don't even see how any sane person
how crazy this stuff gets.
Like, that's a good idea.
It's again, it's the land of make-believe. And it's one thing I will say is that, when children and adults go into a courtroom or are talking to caseworkers, adults are just more articulate. Adults can explain things and make their case in a way that children are not going to be able to. And I think we are just sort of listening to the adults here and allowing them to sort of determine what happens without focusing on the best interests of the child, which is really what our child protection system is supposed to be about.
If I gave you a wand and you could wave that wand to solve this problem, what aspect at the policy level, what you'd wave the wand and you'd do what?
So I would give our agencies better tools for understanding risk management, rather than just sort of their gut feelings or their ideology. There are predictive risk modeling tools that help us understand things like, for instance, if someone has recently been released from prison to a particular address and they're a violent felon, and you get a call about a child abuse incident at that place, that's an urgent call. Like, you should go there soon because likely something serious has happened. And so we get a lot of calls about child protection, and trying to figure out how to engage in triage and risk assessment is a really important one. It's not like the sexiest thing to talk about, but it's really important. But the second thing I would do is just say, look, we need to have the same standards for all kids, regardless of race. We need to stop being so focused on racial disparities when it comes to child welfare. And we need to focus, most importantly, on the best interests of the child and protecting the child. This is a system that revolves around the interests and desires of adults, and we need to fix that.
So if it's okay, I'm going to throw a curveball at you. This may be a little outside your area, and certainly don't feel compelled to answer this. But my dad, and when he retired, So he was an engineer. He was extraordinary. He just had this like crazy mind that I don't have at all. He was meticulous and with detail and such. But anyway, but he turned that toward, have you heard of CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocate? Yeah.
Yeah.
So he did that. And trust me, if you were ever a kid in trouble or jeopardy, like this is the man you would want. I mean, just utterly meticulous, like just at another level of being like every dental records. And, but he was telling me about a guy he had, a young kid who was found guilty of rape. He raping another boy. He did this serially. I'll spare you the other details, but I think if memory serves me correctly, there were 3 people. Let's see. Okay, so sorry. Let me just get this straight in my head. If memory serves me correctly, there were 13 children, 3 of whom from 4 of whom had different fathers. Anyway, but my point is, all of these kids were born addicted to a substance or fetal alcohol syndrome, at what have you. They were all under the care. All but 3 were under the care of the criminal justice system. My point for this long, not as coherent story as it could have been, was, do you have a position, or do you have any thoughts on, like, if you have one fentanyl addicted child or crack addicted child or fetal alcohol syndrome, then we give you a choice. You get your tubes tied or you go to prison. I mean, we just cannot allow as a society.
No, I don't. No, I don't. I don't advocate that. I really think that, we have to ensure that kids are safe in their homes. And obviously, it's a risk factor. It's a huge risk factor if you have a child who has already been born substance exposed, and you already have a history of maltreating your child as a result of drug abuse. But frankly, if you can show that you are clean and you are willing to go for regular drug tests, random drug tests that are unannounced, and show that you are clean and that you are now capable, you've turned over a new leaf and you're capable of taking care of that child, I think you should be able to take care of that child.
And if you miss one and you have another child, does the state then step in and sterilize?
No, I don't. I don't think the state should be stepping in to sterilize. I think that the state should be stepping in to rescue children who are in danger. And that is the extent of the state's role here. So if you have another child and you're high on drugs, that should also influence like how many chances you get in terms of reunifying with the child and whether your parental rights should be terminated more quickly or less quickly. But no, I don't favor sterilization.
Okay. All right. Real quick. I know you're running. We have a hard stop. So you wrote the article, Parents Need to Stop Crazy Shopping for Their Kids' Dorm Rooms. A great article. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
A little. So I have to have some light entertainment. So I have 2 teenagers in my house right now, and we're going to be dealing with college soon. And a friend of mine who has a kid leaving for college this year sent me to the Facebook group Dorm Room Mamas, which I highly recommend for entertainment value. But it is full of hundreds of thousands of crazy helicopter parents who are asking important questions like, should I send my kid to school with a carbon monoxide detector? What kind of bathrobe should I buy my 18-year-old son? Do you think my child should wear flip-flops in the shower? And other important questions like that. So if you want the lighter side of my writing,
levity.
It's all on the website too.
Christina, did you have any last questions? Because I think Naomi has to run pretty soon.
Oh, it would have to be for another conversation, because I'd love to talk about the residential treatment center issue too, which of course is how I sort of discovered all of Naomi's work. She's the only person who has ever written anything that even remotely makes sense on the residential treatment center issue that I was able to come across and just surveying Google.
Well, I'll give you this very short answer, which is that everybody's decided that any kind of congregate care is the worst thing in the world. And they don't understand that we have kids who we've left in foster care for a very long time, or left in homes where they've been abused and neglected for years, and they have such severe mental and behavioral health problems that by the time we remove them, we cannot just put them in some kind of typical family. They're going to need serious psychiatric intervention and probably 24-hour supervision. And we have shut down all the congregate care many congregate care facilities all over the country, and
Dropped
have
by
left.
like 60% or something since 2010.
And so instead, these kids are staying in child welfare offices, hotels, and homeless shelters
And at
because we
least
have
like
decided they
18,
can't have congregate care.
at least like 18 states have done that, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
And just to conclude, everybody should be opposed to that, independent of whether you're a liberal leaning or a conservative. Like every person, like there should be a univocality on certain policies regarding child. I'm not going to use welfare, but child protection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. No brainer. Kids should not be sleeping on cots in child welfare offices or homeless shelters or hotels. Yep. Bipartisan, I promise.
Okay.
There's
Well,
this
thank-
whole activist movement to try and shut down treatment centers too, not just for foster kids, but for kids who are like me. I went to a residential treatment center when I was a teenager because I had a really hard time, but it really helped me. I went to the same one that Paris Hilton went to, and she's been testifying all over the country about the abuse she experienced. Sorry, I have strong feelings about her story.
So where can people find you if they want to find your work?
So NaomiRiley.com is my website. You can find my work there. Links to books I've written, including No Way to Treat a Child. Encourage you to go there and contact me if you have any questions.
Great. And real quick before we end, is there anything Christina and I should have asked you that we didn't ask you?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of the field. Christina's really done her homework lately.
Yeah.
And so I'm happy about that. But these cases keep coming up, and I'm happy to talk about different states and different policies as they get more insane, unfortunately.
Right. There's still so much more.
Yeah.
So much more. There's so much legislation going on right now too. That we need to do something about. We need to be talking about it more.
Well, I appreciate the work you do, Christina. Thanks for helping today, because you obviously know far more about this issue than I do. And I genuinely appreciate advocating for the rights of those who can't advocate for themselves. So thanks. Okay, keep your cameras on, and we're going to conclude. Thanks to Reed as always, for helping out. And thanks for everybody in the chats. And we appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This falls under the umbrella of my nonprofit, National Progress Alliance. Your generous donations keep us going and help fuel content like this. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.